Welcome back to Perfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co host and dear friend, Jacob Acquire. We are 19 days away from the Carolina Panthers hosting the Chicago Bears, 15 days until the official season opener between the Seattle Seahawks and the New England Patriots. And that means cut day is right around the corner. It's this coming Sunday when we have to start trimming the roster down, getting down to the 53, and this is where I think the rubber hits the road. We're two, well, technically we've played three preseason games. We're about to play our fourth coming up this Friday. But this is where all the work, training camp, practices leading up into this, where we figure out who our team is and who we're going to be this fall. Any big takeaways, both nationally, locally, that has caught your eye as we kind of ramp up towards the start of the NFL season?
Well, it's hard to not have these things catch your eye today, and those are the rivalry jerseys. They weren't great last year. I think they downgraded this year. And if you want to talk about a downgrade, I don't know if it's necessarily a downgrade. Let me be very clear, but the Cleveland Browns named Deshaun Watson their starter. I don't know how much of a downgrade that is from Shador Sanders. I imagine both will start games this year. But I think it's important to look at that because Carolina plays Cleveland in week 3. And I saw an interesting take out there about naming Watson the starter, where Cleveland fans were booing him during the practices. If by week 3 the Browns are 0-2, which you know should be pretty likely given the state of their quarterback play, could they, for their home opener, which is week 3, the Carolina Panthers are their home opener, could they switch quarterbacks for that game if Watson just stinks it up the first 2 games? I don't know. I saw that take out there. It didn't look like Todd Monken was too thrilled with Watson's performance throughout training camp. I know he had a comment when Watson was talking about the people booing him. Todd Monken, the new head coach, just said, "Well, if you don't want to get booed, play better." And then right after that, the team mysteriously named Watson the starter. I don't know. Do you think we could be seeing Shador Sanders or even Taylor Green, the rookie, by week 3? Because Watson just at this point, all even if you put all the other stuff aside, he's just a bad football player. So I'm not too sure what the point is to naming him the starter.
Watson hasn't been able to stay healthy even when he has started. I feel like this is definitely a call from ownership or the front office in terms of like who's starting. I know Todd Monken is claiming Deshaun Watson gives him the best chance of winning, but clearly hasn't proved it in the preseason. Apparently, he proved it in the joint practices against the Buffalo Bills. But when you look at their schedule, the Jacksonville Jaguars were, I believe, a 13-win team last year. They play in week 1 in Jacksonville, and then they stay on the road and go to Tampa Bay. So they're in Florida for the first 2 weeks, and both of those teams are have playoff aspirations. They're good squads that I think have competent defensive rosters. And when you look at that and you look at how they're going to match up with the Browns, it doesn't seem like a favorable matchup. So I don't know if it'll be week 3 or potentially week 5, because after that they play the Panthers and the Steelers at home. If you have two home stinkers and you're not injured up to that point, and say you're 0-4, I think there might be change on the horizon. What that looks like, I'm not exactly sure. But again, this is a player who had a fall from grace between off the field issues and then getting back on the field. And it is a little disheartening when he doesn't take accountability, especially from the press, and seems to uh, I dismiss the Cleveland Browns as a fan base when it's like you haven't put your best foot forward, you haven't given anything to cheer for, and you think you're blameless in this situation. It is definitely eye opening to say the least.
And I wouldn't say Cleveland's a bad fan base. They show up and cheer for 0-16 teams, right? This It's one of the more passionate fan bases, and to just kind of give them the finger with your comments and pressers. I It doesn't resonate well with me. I'm sure the fan base has already made it known that it doesn't resonate well with them. It was weird too because Shador Sanders started that last preseason game and played for most of the first half. Then Watson came in the second half. That's usually when the backup and the third and fourth stringers play, but now he's the starter. So we'll have to see how that goes there. One thing you wanted to talk about before we got into reviewing the game this past week was a segment you saw. I think it was on CBS Sports, and I think it's interesting because the Panthers and the Texans play this week. They have joint practices tomorrow, but the whole Deshaun Watson of it is that CJ Stroud is the guy that replaced him. And then I wouldn't say he necessarily played at such a high level that Watson did in Houston, but he took the Texans further than, he appeared to take them further than Watson had done. And there was an interesting segment that you sent me on Twitter. I don't remember if it was this morning or a couple of days ago, where they were debating who would you rather have this year, or what quarterback do you have more faith in to this point, Bryce Young or CJ Stroud? I think it's an interesting conversation because obviously Stroud had the phenomenal rookie year. He has the playoff success, but he's been on kind of a bit of a downturn, whereas Bryce has steadily improved every. He's still not a superstar, but it's an interesting point to make based on trajectory and how each team is set up now.
They've both played 46 games. They've missed a couple games with injuries through their first 3 seasons. The difference is obviously CJ Stroud plays with an amazing defense, and that helps him from a record standpoint. Bryce Young's won 14 games, and CJ Stroud has won 28. Obviously, Stroud has made the postseason 3 times. Bryce Young finally made his first playoff appearance this past year. When you look at some of the numbers, it definitely does favor CJ Stroud. I think it does help that he's had Nico Collins his entire time there. I will say over the past couple of years, I think Bryce Young's offensive line has taken a step above what CJ Stroud is working with in front of him. I, I think it just comes down to like who do you think is going to be able to take that next step? I think Bryce Young, his best trajectory is becoming a Drew Brees kind of player, and I think it's starting to potentially work itself that way if he is going to transcend into a player that you want to pay. But I think what comes down to is Stroud had an awful playoff performance and he's got to bounce back. And they both have to if they're going to want to get paid, which is what you want as an NFL player. I know Alex Zetlow was just on with I think Ari Maroff. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the national beat writer's name correctly, but they spoke at length about Bryce Young and this being a prove it year. And he's apparently had his best training camp so far. And you want to see that continue against a really good defense tomorrow. I think that is arguably one of the better tests. Like if you see on 7-on-7s, 11-on-11s, like Bryce Young and the Panthers are just getting battered. It's not a good look moving forward. But if they hold their own, they're able to make plays. I think that pretty much indicates what we've seen up to this point, that they are taking that step and they are ready to kind of move into an era where it is Bryce Young, T Mac, and this young ascending offense. I I know you're a Bryce Young fan because obviously you have your ties to Alabama. You thought he was the better quarterback coming out of that draft class. Who do you think is better, and who do you think needs to prove it more this year, so to speak? Because obviously the Texans are shaping up to have like this world class defense, and they just need an average offense to make a Super Bowl run. Whereas the Panthers, they would need a lot to go right to make a playoff run like the Texans are hoping to be able to do.
To your first point, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I think Young is slightly ahead right now. I think he has to do more for his team, and I think you brought up a good point to where the expectation part of it, or who has higher expectations this year, or who needs to have a better year, excuse me, it's definitely Stroud because this is a team that has Super Bowl aspirations, the way that their defense is built. Just look at what they were able to do in the playoffs last year with Stroud just barely staying afloat on offense. That defense was shutting down. They had was it the Chargers in the first game, and then the Patriots. They were giving Drake May all kinds of problems, and Drake May was a guy who was the MVP runner-up. I think Stroud needs to have a bigger year, but both of these guys really need to have big years. I'm glad you brought up the money because there was a report that CJ Stroud was apparently asking for 70 million a year, whereas the team was leaning closer to 50, which is more in line with his level of play and extensions. If you want $70 million per year with a team like this, you got to make the AFC Championship, or just advance in the playoffs like you continue to do, because this is a team that's set up for everything. And if Stroud falters again in the postseason, there could be disgruntled QBs out there that could be an upgrade over him. So I would say I think Stroud needs to do it more this year, but both players need to have good years because if Bryce Young falls back into his rookie year, the Panthers are just going to draft a quarterback this year because there are a lot of quarterbacks this year. And if CJ Stroud doesn't perform to where he can help elevate a team that should be a deep playoff team, then Houston may be able to draft somebody or trade up to pick someone, or just trade for a guy like Joe Burrow, who it seems like every other year he's frustrated with the Bengals. So you never know there. But it was an interesting discussion for sure. Obviously, if you asked this question 2 years ago, it's Stroud without a doubt. But I think Bryce has steadily, like slowly, steadily ascended. I think you saw in the playoff game what he can be, whereas Stroud in the brightest moments, the past 2 years, his rookie year he was quite good under the lights, but the past 2 years in the brightest moments he tends to shrink within himself. So I don't know. It's an interesting thought discussion.
It is. For me, I think the biggest knock is like if you look at like yards per attempt, yards per game, Bryce Young just he's got to get above the 200 passing yard benchmark. I know
Sure.
it's a weird number. It's not necessarily something that's like analytically backed, but it's just you got to be able to move the ball. And I think I want to see that a little bit more. We talked about it last week when the offense was struggling to get anything going against the Buffalo Bills defense is like, hey, you got to take more shots. And at first, I kind of lead into the Jacksonville Jaguars game in those first two series. It didn't look good that first series. And then the second series came out. It looked like Bryce Young was settled down a little bit more. And we can keep making excuses for Bryce Young about how this player missed a block or this receiver missed an assignment. But the whole point about being a quarterback that can kind of transcend or lift some of those issues, I started to see on that second drive, moving up in the pocket when it's collapsing and being able to find Tommy Tremble on the side, finding T Mac across the middle to set up pretty much the go ahead touchdown for Jonathan Brooks. It's the little stuff like that of keeping the offense on track that the more he's able to do that, especially earlier on in the game, to keep us in it, build leads, that's what you want to see from a franchise quarterback. And if he can continue to do more of that, I think that is going to be reflective of what we want to see from a franchise quarterback.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the story of that starting group really is having Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt back in the game. Because that interior pressure that we faced versus Buffalo just wasn't there against Jacksonville. And granted, Jacksonville, they weren't playing their defensive starters like Buffalo was. So that helped a bit. But just having Rob Hunt and Delu in there really made things easy as far as protection goes. With one key exception, which we can touch on when we get to some of the more negative points. But like you said, that second series, I liked the way the ball was being spread around. Got Coker, Tremble, T Mac, just throwing it across the field. I think he was 4 for 5 on the second series for like 50 yards or something. Um, uh, team, I don't know. It could have been a touchdown. I thought the spot was a bit iffy on the T Mac, the second T Mac catch, but it was cool to see Jonathan Brooks get involved in both the run and the pass game. He's moving phenomenally. He looks like the player he looked like at Texas. And if we get 12 to 17 games of that plus per year, that's a huge upgrade to the rushing room because this has been a team that hasn't had a rusher that's had over was it like a 30 or no, Rico Dowdle got like 150 yarder last year, but we need explosive runs, and this has not been a team that's been able to have them. Brooks had quite the game, I would say, except for the pass pro. And I'm gonna cut him some slack because he's a guy coming off of two ACLs, but you gotta go attack him in pass pro. I think every pressure that Young faced in both of those drives, Brooks was probably involved in some whiffs in the pass pro, especially the
He
first play of the game. He whiffs on a guy, and Bryce has to make a guy miss rolling out to the right. So
on
obviously,
that second drive, Brooks picks up a couple, but I
he
think it
picks
goes
up
to
a
a
couple,
point.
but he also missed a few. But that's
Rama,
he can't practice that too, right? With torn ACLs, because pass pro isn't something like, all right, I'm gonna stand here and I'm at the spot. You gotta get to your spot, then go attack the. You gotta be an offensive lineman, and that's something we didn't see last week with the Terrell Bernard batted pass. But I think we're gonna see that more as Brooks becomes more comfortable with getting hit, facing contact, and being a full time NFL player again.
I think it goes more to the point because I understand your physicality point, but Ramondre Stevenson this past week came out and said, like, hey, pass pro, from a running back standpoint is like 90% knowing who you're supposed to block, and then the other 10% is actually finishing the block. And I think that's a testament because Travion Henderson, he didn't really have injuries last year as a rookie. Came out of Ohio State. A lot of people are like, this guy's phenomenal in pass pro. Like his effort is off the charts. And he wasn't that great last year. I think it is like an element of like learning the NFL. It's not only a little bit more faster pace, but like defenses are going to send different blitzes and looks, and you got to know where you're supposed to be. And I think as he gets more comfortable with that, I think he can bring the physicality. We saw that as like a runner, the explosiveness. He can be there. It's just a matter of knowing where you're supposed to be and being in the right place to make those blocks. So I love that we brought up a player that kind of had an up and down performance, more ups than downs. But I think this leads into like risers and fallers. And obviously we come away with a massive victory, winning 34-17 in Jacksonville. Like you said, they didn't really start their starters, but this was a game we dominated from start to finish. Who were your, I would say, favorite performances? We quoted from, or not quoted, we posted from our Twitter account the Ryan Fitzgerald 61-yard field goal. It's interesting. Cam Little, he's the guy that I think currently holds the NFL record for the longest field goal, or he's up there. He's
Was also in preseason, I believe, last year, right?
and the fact that like, hey, you're able to go into his stadium, his home turf, and you're able to kick a 61-yarder as time is expiring in the first half is I wouldn't say inspirational, but it's one of those things that makes you feel good. I think he's got his moxie, and you want that with a kicker because so many times I don't think it's like necessarily talent with kickers as much as you have to have the mentality of like, hey, I'm going to hit everything that I'm kicking. And the second you lose that, that's tends to be when kickers spiral and you got to look for your next one.
It definitely takes the sting off of Harrison Butker hitting a 69-yarder a couple hours later, knowing that he was once a Panther. But 61 yarder. I can't remember the last time we had kickers attempting 60 yarders like Joey Sly, like 5 or 6 years ago. And my first joking thought after that was Bryce Young's gonna have so much more game winning drives now. Now that he only has to move the ball like 10 yards before Fitzgerald can boot it, but it's a weapon having a guy like that. So it was really great to see. I think he did miss a short field goal following that. It was actually a 30 yarder, so half of the distance of the 61 yarder. Other than that, it was perfect. What I want to, it's not necessarily a riser, but one of my favorite things from this game and the preseason as a whole is that in the final 2 minutes of halves, the Panthers are 5 for 5 scoring the ball. Obviously, this game was suspended at the end for weather reasons. I don't know if the Panthers would have wanted to score again, although we did have the ball and we were around midfield, so it could have been 6 for 6. But operating, and granted, this is going to be without the starters, right? But operating the 2 minute drill effectively is a huge thing that I've been looking at because 2 years ago, when Bryce Young was named the starter again after Andy Dalton got in the car accident, the team was very good at end of half drills and stuff like that. 2025, the team took a little bit of a step back, so I want to see more and better execution there. And so far throughout the preseason, we've seen that from Brad Idzik and the people he's deploying out there. So I would say Idzik has been a riser in that regard, and I think it showed in this game.
Yeah, and like you said, it builds off what we saw with Bryce Young when he came back from that benching is your ability to execute at the final kind of series at both ends of the halves. And that's good. Like you want to be able to kind of put points on the board, especially give yourself a shot to do what the Patriots were known to do so well for so long. And that was, hey, score at the end of the first half, get the ball at the top of the second half, score again, and either build a lead or come back or it really puts yourself in a position to really take control of the game. And so I think the more that you're able to kind of hone in and execute in those scenarios, the better you're going to be as a football team. A couple other people I think we can point out, Shaw Smith Wade, he had a phenomenal interception. I know
Oh
some
yeah.
people were saying it was like a top three all time Panthers interception. I think personally, Josh Norman had three or four that were exceptional, and that's not even getting into some of the crazier ones from some of the other safeties or cornerbacks we've had in our history. It was great. He dove in front of the guy, made a rolling interception, was able to maintain control. I think we could talk about guys on the offense, but Shaw Smith Wade, I think blossoming into this slot corner is going to kind of put him ahead of Corey Thornton, who I thought had kind of the edge going into a lot of these preseason games. I don't know what your thought is on that necessarily, but maybe it's good to have two players that are as good as they are, because then you feel comfortable for some reason Mike Jackson gets banged up for a game or two, that hey, you can put Thornton on the outside and still have Shaw Smith Wade in the slot, and vice versa. It's just it gives you a lot more tools in your toolbox and doesn't feel necessarily as pressure to make sure like, hey, we got to keep everybody healthy, otherwise like we don't have the horses to keep up with offenses.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought Thornton had the edge coming into the preseason as well, but Shaw Smith Wade has performed in every game. I think he's been nothing short of outstanding, honestly, other than getting shaken out of his shoes by Amir Abdullah when the Jags were backed up to their 1 yard line. That wasn't great. It reminded me of funnily enough, the ETN run last year that Travis Etienne had, like the 70-yard run when we played the Jags in Week 1. Similar vibes there, but other than that, I think he's been playing his coverages very well. He's been tackling, and he's probably won the lead back in that slot corner, nickel corner kind of battle. Um, Obviously, we'll have J.C. Horn mixed in there as well, so that'll be interesting to see. But I think Smith Wade, or as Steve Smith said on the broadcast, Smith Shaw Wade, I think he's been playing quite well in the preseason. Sam Hecht is another one who, we talked about that Hall of Fame game. He started going against Andrew Billings and some veterans on the Cardinals D line. It didn't look great. I think he's looked really good since then, to be honest. Even in the Buffalo game, I thought he looked good. And in this game, I thought he was phenomenal, getting off the ball quickly. One of the things that I remember when I was watching Tyler Linderbaum at Iowa, he was such a fast mover off the ball. Obviously, the center is going to be a fast mover because they know when the ball is moving when they snap it. But to get on poles or to get into their zone to block, Linderbaum was so fast. Hecht, not as fast, but he's similar in that regard, where he gets off the snap so quick and engages at a high level. I think that's going to be huge if you want to have more extravagant run games, like having center poles and like center combos, stuff like that. I thought he's been playing very well. And then we've talked about it every week, the receivers, right? Anytime that Jimmy Horn and John Mechie touch the ball, something good happens. Mechie in particular had a really good second half. It looked like some of the old Alabama stuff they were running, like with the like quick slants and up the middle stuff like that. So it's going to be really hard to take either Mechie or Jasim Reed off the team, but that's a decision for Dan Morgan and the Panthers this Sunday, because to this point, I don't think you can cut Jimmy Horn anymore. I think he is solidly receiver 5 behind T Mac, Coker, Liget, and Tremaine. I think to me, Jimmy Horn is the proven receiver 5. He was doing punt returns and stuff too, kick returns, all the stuff we've been wanting to see. He's doing it all, and he's catching the ball and taking hits too with that smaller frame. So I think he's really going to blossom as a rotation piece for the Panthers this year. Hopefully.
He adds that other gear in the offense, which again we don't really have. We were expecting to get that out of Chris Brazell, who obviously is done for the year. I touch on your point about Sam Heck, Ben Fennell, who is a NFL analyst. He's previously been with the Eagles, as necessarily no ties to the Carolina Panthers, but he thought just turning on Sam Heck's film, like, hey, he doesn't know what the Luke Fortner plan was, but he thinks that once Hecht is named the starting center at some point, he will be the starter in Carolina for quite some time. Thinks he has the ability to be one of the better centers in this past draft class. And that's a lot of praise. This isn't a local beat writer. This is a national writer who's turning on the film, giving his kind of analysis. And this is beyond what you and me are seeing as just Panthers fans, people that have hyped up Sam Hex since the draft. And I think that's a good indication that, hey, since that Hall of Fame game, going against some of the more stronger interior defensive linemen, like you're taking a step. You had your like welcome to the NFL moment, and he's starting to take kind of control and letting things settle down. And I think the practice tomorrow against the Houston Texans will also be another big test as you're kind of ramping up to get ready. But to your point, like John Mechie stepping up, having 6 receptions, 77 yards against the Jacksonville Jaguars. No other Panthers wide receiver had 5 or more than 5 receptions or over 50 yards. And he's cashing in. He's making big plays. He's a reliable target. Like you said, Bryson Tremaine has kind of solidified himself as a wide receiver 4 in this offense. Jimmy Horn is starting to solidify himself. And it brings up a conversation that we've had, and I think we're going to continue to have, depending on what happens this Sunday. But David Moore, I don't know if he's going to be on this roster. I know, like, hey, Dave Canales, you're trying to put your system into place in Carolina the first couple years. This is a wide receiver that you can trust. That's a reliable target for Bryce Young. But what does he give you that these other wide receivers aren't giving you? Like, to me, like, I haven't seen like a drop issue from a lot of these guys. They're reliable. Like you said, Jimmy Horn is catching the ball and getting hit, and he's getting back up and still giving us plays as the game goes on. Like, what is it that David Moore would provide outside of just being a veteran in the locker room and able to kind of be a sounding board for some of these other wide receivers? There doesn't seem to be much value to him being on the roster as opposed to some of these other guys we're discussing.
And we haven't even brought up Jasim Reed, who missed this game, who prior to this game and practices, he scored in both of the previous preseason games. I'm glad you brought up David Moore because I think it's a huge, not learning moment, but growth moment for Dave Canales in year 3 as head coach. He's already given up play calling, which admit he when he took the job back in 2024, he said a big part of it was that he was going to call plays for Bryce Young. Like that was part of the pitch, and him giving that up, I think, shows growth. But I think for a team like you're saying, with aspirations to get back into the playoffs to win the division again, it would be the first time Carolina's won it back to back in I guess 12 years, 2013 through 2015, for a team that is trying to advance and grow and not just be one of the bottom feeders anymore. You can't turn away talent. And obviously, guys like McMillan, Coker, Liget, they're blocks to make the team. Bryson Tremaine plays every position and is a good teams player. So those are your 4 key guys there. But guys like Mechie, Jimmy Horn, Jasim Reed, all of them I think are more talented, can create more explosive plays, can provide a similar or a unique niche on the offense or in special teams in Horn's case, or in all of their cases. They've all been good at returning kicks in the preseason that David Moore right now cannot do. And I think it would be a huge moment of growth for Dave Canales to let go of a guy he's been comfortable with in order to possibly or potentially grow some talent from some of these younger, more explosive receivers. And I know that Moore's a reliable guy. He's been a guy that's caught some tough passes from Bryce Young, particularly in 2024. But I think if you're a team that's looking to make the playoffs, you can't turn away talent. And seeing how the team's receiver room is going to look after Sunday, I think is going to be a good step in that direction. David Moore is also a vested veteran, so they could cut him and sign him back to the practice squad instantly, and there would be no harm done there. Whereas Jimmy Horn, Jasim Reed, I think John Mechie still falls under this. If you cut those guys, they're subjected to waivers as well, and I don't think you can risk losing Horn, Jasim Reed, or even Mechie to waivers at this point. So it wouldn't shock me, and I think you and I both hopefully or agree that we don't necessarily want to see David Moore have the spot of one of these guys that has a higher potential.
Yeah, you want to have the the most talent on the 53. And so I personally, this is where, like, if you're wanting to keep David Moore, this is where, and I've seen different 53 man like roster projections where they keep 4 running backs. To me, it would be Trevor Etienne goes. You cut him if you want to like make it work and keep 7 wide receivers on this squad. But in my opinion, the having the 6, keeping obviously Chuba Hubbard, Jonathan Brooks, AJ Dillon, like that's really the core group between your running backs and your wide receivers. And they get in the tight ends. Like, we've brought Darren Waller on this team, and I don't know if he plays Friday. Dave Canales has kind of alluded to like getting game reps when you've only had a couple weeks to practice isn't really necessarily beneficial. So I think reports from tomorrow's practice will be more indicative, I think, of his spot on the roster. But again, goes back to the point of that 2024 draft class with Xavier Legette, Jonathan Brooks, Trayvon Wallace, and JT Sanders, where you're supposed to get this influx of talent on the offense and have a reliable linebacker. We haven't gotten any of that necessarily. And so I think it goes back to the point of like where we're talking about cut candidates. I think JT Sanders is on that block. He's not necessarily giving you anything on special teams because that's what Felipe Franks is doing. He's not big enough to be an impact player in the run game like Tommy Tremble and Mitchell Evans. And he hasn't done anything from a pass catching standpoint in these preseason games. Like, you want to kind of make a statement of going, hey, I'm a contributor on this team. It should have shown up on film. And the fact that they bring in Darren Waller, who is known for his pass catching ability, that just seems to indicate to me that JT Sanders does not seem to be a part of the big picture. And I would be shocked to see him on the 53-man roster this coming Sunday.
It's tough, right? Because you mentioned that 2024 draft class. Xavier Leggett, we've harped on him, hasn't lived up to being a first round receiver. Really, that entire run there of receivers, other than Lad McConkey, just has had a rough go of it so far in the league. Jonathan Brooks spent his first 2 years mostly injured. Hopefully, he's back this year. Trevin Wallace, the linebacker two competition, Dave Canales said yesterday, is still ongoing. It's still head to head. We are, like what did you say, 19 days away from the Panthers playing real NFL football against Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams, right? You would hopefully have a starting linebacker in place, but that competition is still ongoing. So
And
Trevin
Liam Cohen
Wallace,
put him in a blender week one last year. Like, this is where I'm just like, you talk
exactly.
about like that matchup. Like, I'm dreading it.
Yeah, thankfully, Devin Lloyd's on the team now too. And then after that, JT Sanders, like you mentioned, who I thought he was blossoming as a rookie prior to having that the neck injury against Kansas City, and it's been kind of a downturn from there. Luckily, Shaw Smith Wade is showing up. I think he is a good piece from that draft, and getting Mike Jackson obviously is another big boon in that one. But yeah, JT Sanders, I think this is a an enormous week for him because yes, I think it would be really tough for Dan Morgan to cut what was, I would assume, a top 110 pick from that class. I don't remember exactly what pick he was.
Was
I
he
think
picked
he was the
100,
first pick.
101? Yeah,
He was the
hold on.
first pick of
I'll
day
look.
3, I recall. Maybe the second pick, but a player of that high value. It's not a seventh rounder or sixth rounder. It's somebody that you took a chance on and want to be a part of the team, but he hasn't really differentiated himself as a receiver. Whereas Darren Waller, coming off of retirement last year, 25% of his catches went for touchdowns. He only had, I think it was 24 catches and 6 were touchdowns, but he showed that even rusty, he can be a bigger impact in the passing game, particularly where the Panthers need it in the middle of the field than JT Sanders has been able to show so far. We'll see about joint practices this week. I don't think it's a stretch to say that it's, if Waller does play, it's Waller versus Sanders for a job at this point. But it's just disheartening to see because Morgan has followed it up with, I think, two great consecutive drafts back to back in 25 and this past year. But that first year where you mentioned the year 3 is where stuff really, like, that's where your quote unquote prime should start for NFL players, like where you take that next step. And a lot of the players in that draft class for Carolina have not. The caveat I'll mention is Jalen Coker as an undrafted free agent in this class. He seems to be hitting his stride. So if you think about Mike Jackson and Jalen Coker, it kind of makes up for all the other picks.
It does. I was looking back at that draft class. JT Sanders went at pick up 101, and a couple picks prior to him, Peyton Wilson went. And
Mm,
I hyped him up when we did our team's draft, like, what, 2 weeks
a
ago
couple weeks
now.
ago.
And so it's one of those things that, like, had we had him instead of Trayvon Wallace, I understand the injury concerns coming out of college, and Trayvon Wallace was more this guy that could kind of potentially evolve into a starting caliber player. It hasn't played out. Like, we should have just taken the in-state kind of Carolina product that we did with Xavier Leggett, so to speak, if we were kind of keeping that trend going. And it did end up working out that way, but it's just interesting to see when you look back at kind of the draft results. And you and I were higher on Peyton Wilson. Again, it was the asterisk with the injury concerns that you had with a player
Well,
like him.
and I think that what Carolina and what we as fans should hope for this year is that playing next to Devin Lloyd, who's an All Pro last year, who's at multiple tiers above what Trevin Wallace's running mates have been. You know, it was Christian Roseboom last year and Josie Jewell the year before that. I think you would hope that Wallace, or excuse me, Devin Lloyd being the green dot and calling the defense would allow Trevin Wallace to fly around and just make plays with his speed and strength. We will have to see because, like you said, week one's going to be a massive test. If anyone's going to find a weakness in your system, or like find the weak link, it's going to be Ben Johnson, right? So that's going to be a pretty big test week 1. Do you have any other notes you want to talk about this week's preseason game? I don't expect the starters to play. At least
No.
I wouldn't expect the defensive starters to play because the offense has been, I think we're what, 1 for 5 on scoring drives, the starting offense. So maybe if Coach Canales feels like the joint practice isn't enough work, maybe they throw him out there for a series. I don't think you can learn anything from lining up against the Texans starters in the preseason because their Texas defense, excuse me, because they're gonna beat our players. That's just how good they are. So I don't know what the point would be there. I don't mind if the starters don't play at all, um, because it is what it is at this point. Joint practices are a little bit more valuable. Did you have a thought about this week's stuff with Houston before we move on to takes?
No, I think at this point, I think Dave Canales even kind of alluded to is like if they get enough reps tomorrow, the starters will not see the field on Friday, and I think that's smart. Like you don't want, I and I hate to say it, but you don't want Daniil Hunter or Will Anderson to end the season before it gets going with a guy
Right.
like injuring Bryce Young or something like that on like a freak play, and it's like, hey, get the practice reps, get kind of like some of this like back and forth between a good defense, win as many of these reps as you can, stay afloat against arguably a top 3 unit. I know a lot of people are speculating about Aaron Donald returning and they could be an all-time great defense with the Rams, but what they're building in Houston is pretty spectacular as well. And so it's just holding your own against a defense like that. And I think if Dave Canales, Brad Idzik sees enough from this group, I'm okay with that. And again, it all then becomes the shuffling of these players that we're discussing about, like on the fringe. They got to show up and make plays with the backups to show that they're worthy of a roster spot. And that's why I think we're going to key in on when we're like seeing the highlights from Wednesday's joint practice, and then obviously the last and final preseason game on Friday.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It would suck for fans if the starters don't play because this is the only home preseason game for Carolina this year. Had 3 road ones so far, kind of a tough slate to start, but it's probably for the best, right? It would be cool to see Monroe Freeling against some of these guys, but he's going to get that work in joint practices where I think the coaches are paying much more attention. I have my take ready. I'm going to include a second take because the cut day will be prior to when we talk to you guys again. So I'm going to throw 2 takes in there. The first one being one that we've already talked about. Oh, I meant to unhighlight it there from the Google Doc. I think JT Sanders will unfortunately miss the 53. There are just so many positions that you have to account for when you're looking at roster cutdowns. The Panthers, particularly the offensive line, is an important one because I think if you're on the PUP list, physically unable to perform, I think you initially have to be part of the first 53. Then you can get replaced. So the Panthers have a lot of those guys between Taylor Moton, I believe Ikwanu's on that list, and Turk Wharton. So I think initially those 3 guys count against the 53, and I think it would be at the expense of JT Sanders. He has to have a really big week this week in order to stave off a guy like Darren Waller or even one of the other tight ends we've seen in the preseason so far. My second take, it's kind of in regards to this is kind of a layup, though, in my opinion. I just wanted to throw it out there. Haynes King is making the 53. This may have been less of a take had he played in other preseason games and gotten to show some stuff, but he is not playing this week. He didn't play in preseason games 1 and 2, excuse me. The only game he played in was the Hall of Fame game, so that's his only tape for other teams to watch. And if you cut Haynes King and another team that like the Dolphins or the Falcons or the Browns, who will play in week 3, look at him and see, oh, we have a QB need. This is Haynes King's only film so far. Let's take a chance on him. You're going to lose him to waivers. So I think Carolina is going to keep Haynes King, even if it may not be the best move. I think it would be a good move because in the long run, he could track to be a better backup than Kenny Pickett. So those are my double takes back to back. JT Sanders, unfortunately, will not make the 53, and it maybe in his stead, Haynes King will make it.
So, in regards to that take, I'm assuming we roster 3 quarterbacks in that situation.
Yes, and I mean, I want to be clear. I mean the final fit, like the team we're taking into next week's practices. So like you have initial cut day where you have to get down, and then there's some maneuvering because other teams cut their players so you can get people on waivers and stuff like that. I mean that when we are gearing up for Chicago, like game week 0 or game week 1, King will be on the 53 and Sanders will not. Those are my takes.
I like it. Yeah, obviously you had your take blacked out, and I was leaning towards doing the double cut that JT Sanders
Ah,
and David Moore don't make the roster, but you kind of beat me to the punch there. So again, a little bit of a pivot here. I what I think we do as a roster, I'm gonna lean more into starting like people that win battles. I think Sam Hecht wins the center battle, and I
mm,
think Shaw Smith Wade wins the cornerback battle. So those two battles that I think at the beginning, when you looked at like the Hall of Fame game, especially kind of like looking into preseason week one, and I think it appeared more like Corey Thornton and Luke Fortner had the edge. I think right now, as things transpire, they are trending on the up and up. Now, Sam Hecht, he may not get the opening day start. We talked about this earlier in the season. I think he starts 4 more games this year. With this take, I'm saying he's starting this whole season. But those are the two camp battles that I think leans themselves to the. I want to in the case of Sam Hecht, it is the younger player, but Shaw Smith Wade I think is a little bit older than Corey Thornton. But those are the two I think that come down to the nail biter. Both their backups will obviously make the roster, but those are the starters I think week one.
and Sam Heck starting week 1. That would be interesting. New or rookie center and rookie right tackle. That would be quite the draft from Dan Morgan. Real quick, I think the only other quote unquote battle between like starting position up for grabs is the linebacker 2 spot. Who do you think wins that spot? I think it's going to be Claude and Charles because I
I
think that
am
the team has put
Yeah.
a ton of trust in him. If it's if Trevin Wallace, I think we're in the lead to be the starter. I don't think the battle would have gone this long. Is how I would put it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if Trevin Wallace had the edge, he's had all the ample opportunities to take that,
Right.
and he hasn't. So I think he kind of flushed that away. The only point the Haynes King, and I want to get this before I forget this, is that the fact that he tore it up against the Arizona Cardinals, and then we watched Joe Milton and Jonathan Mingo tear it up against
Uh,
the Arizona
yeah,
Cardinals.
Mingo got one. He got one.
It makes me worried that like what we saw was obviously a great performance by Haynes King, but is it like okay, are the Cardinals really that good at that rate? Would be my next question. But yes, I think to answer your first question, that I think Claude and Cherilus I think does win the battle against Wallace, and this is where Trevor Wallace needs to go back and he needs to learn as much as he can. He is still a younger player. It's not to say that he can't take a step this year, but it just doesn't look like he is. And that's what happens. Once you get past the first and the second round, you start losing that ability of like finding a quality player. It's not impossible, but the percentages go way down after like pick 50.
Which it would mean all the more if Sam Heck becomes a quality player. Which 3 consecutive years, Shaw Smith Wade, Cam Jackson, Sam Hecht, the fifth rounders would be hits for Dan Morgan, which 3 in a row, fifth rounders, it's pretty phenomenal. I think that's going to be it for us. Obviously, Carolina will practice tomorrow here in Charlotte against the Houston Texans. I don't think fans are still allowed at that game. I still think it's no fan or at that practice. They will host the Texans on Friday, and then we will have cut day on Sunday. So the next time we speak to you guys, we will likely have the main roster in place for week 1. So we'll talk about that. We can talk about what we expect to happen for the Panthers season next week or maybe the following week. But until then, you can find us on Twitter, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your content. For myself and Steve, and for the final game of the preseason, keep pounding.